Hello everyone, I know it has been a very long time since my last video, and this is due to a large number of real-life circumstances that were outside of my control and have prevented me from posting, and have precluded me, for the most part, from purchasing new games. I have to purchase every game that I review through here. I'm now working towards a more stable position, and as such I should be posting much more regularly going forward, but that said, let's just get going. So, Dead Cells is the latest entrant in the ever-expanding roguelike subgenre. It's similar in several respects to games like Enter the Gungeon and Binding of Isaac, but the most direct comparison would probably be Rogue Legacy. It's another 2D roguelike action RPG with some persistent elements. And that sounds pretty cut and dry, right? And on paper, these two games are incredibly similar, but there are some specific details that heavily distinguish one from the other. But comparisons aside, Dead Cells takes inspiration from a lot of different sources actually, and it manages to distill down elements of each into a cohesive whole, I would say. Now these sources run the gamut from retro games, all the way back through the original Metroid and Castlevania games up to Castlevania Symphony of the Night, and all the way up to Dark Souls. Now, if I were a mainstream game reviewer, I'd say this is the Dark Souls of... insert completely arbitrary and possibly unrelated criteria here. But that would be a hacky and oversimplified truth, since the reality is Dead Cells is an incredibly flexible game, and that's an important word here, as it caters to a huge amount of different playstyles and different ways to experience it, which that sounds like a set of buzzwords, and maybe it is, but I think you'll see what I mean as I keep going. The game is set apart from its peers by the refinement in the way it utilizes all its different tools. Procedural generation, tight, timing-based combat, a large number of complementary systems, and persistent player progress are just some of the DNA that Dead Cells shares with a number of other games. But, for starters, let's just cover the first one. So speaking of buzzwords, procedural generation has become something of a buzzword in recent years, and while I have covered this topic at some length in the past, I'll still just give like a quick overview on what this means. Procedural generation is the automatic generation of any kind of video game asset by an algorithmic or mathematical process. This is more a descriptor for how a thing is made than it is a defined, specific discipline in and of itself, and as such, procedural techniques can be used to add topography to a 3D game world, it can be used to randomize pre-created elements, it can be used to create art assets or game maps. Its applications are fairly limitless. Dead Cells uses procedural randomization to great effect, however, and one of the benefits of this particular technique is that it can be used to randomize game levels or maps to keep the player from ever having the same exact experience twice. The downside of this is that the more unpredictable or new you try to make each playthrough, oftentimes you can end up with levels that are nonsensical or completely inconsistent. Dead Cells avoids this pitfall in my experience, and the way it does so can best be described with my favorite cop-out from the story of BioShock Infinite, which is constants and variables. Dead Cells reins in the variation in these randomized levels just enough to keep each playthrough unpredictable, but consistent, and that's the real feat. Most games of this type, they go a bit too far in this particular area. I think most of us that have played these games have had a play session on Enter the Gungeon or Binding of Isaac that was just completely miserable. We had a total drought of useful items, and we ended up getting nothing but shit, in the case of Binding of Isaac, literally, for several floors at a time. And the misery of these runs is usually offset by that occasional run where the stars just align and we get a bunch of interesting and useful things in a reasonable span of time. But while Dead Cells may never hit those highest highs of a game like that, it stays reliably, consistently very enjoyable with every single run that I did, and I can honestly say I never felt the need to restart or scrap a run, which is something that I've been known to do in the past, at any point in my play of Dead Cells, because every run that I made was consistently enjoyable and interesting. But eventually, this has to get old, right? Eventually you have to have seen everything, you have to know exactly how it's going to go, But no, I can say with some certainty that this is not the case, because... So all this smart mapping sets a pretty dang high standard for the rest of the game to match. However, it seems to manage this. The next thing we have to talk about is the game's loot system, which can be broken down into a few separate categories. You have weapons, you have auxiliary items, you have health items, you have currency, and you have what we will call, for the purposes of this review, one-up items, which is basically just a means of leveling up your character. All of this is pretty standard stuff for a game of this type. What's not standard, however, is how all these classes of items interact with one another. The game has a system for these one-up items that is absolutely brilliant in its simplicity. With each discovery of a one-up item, a player must choose which of three categories they will enhance. Red is the category that most melee weapons and grenades will fall into. Purple is the category that most ranged weapons, including bows and spells, fall into. And green is the category that most shields and the heaviest of weapons fall into. This essentially breaks the game into classes, as green is the tank type class, giving the highest initial health bonuses, while purple, or the ranged class, gives the least, with red falling exactly in between. Choosing any one of these categories with your one-up item will increase your character's damage with weapons in that category by exactly 15%, and give them a percentage-based bonus to their total hit points. These health bonuses, however, diminish with each successive choice of the same color, and as such, this poses a choice to the player of prioritizing either increasing their health or their damage output with their given preferred method of dealing damage. And just to be clear, a player will, on a complete playthrough of this game, find upwards of 20 of these different one-up items. So this is not a choice that you make just once, it's a choice that you make several, up to possibly dozens of times. Further than this, however, while the weapon damage bonus is static, the health upgrades compound, meaning that the percentage by which your health points increase is based on the current values of your health, not their initial values. And why does this matter, you ask? Because a creative player can work these level up choices in a variety of different ways. If, for instance, you blow all of your highest percentage health increases early in the game, your late game health increases will offer such diminishing returns that surviving in later areas is next to impossible. However, for a starting player, these early gains could be absolutely essential until they memorize the patterns and attacks of all the enemy types in the levels they choose to progress through. This guarantees the player has a new set of choices with every playthrough, as the order in which you place these one-ups has to vary depending on what items you have at that moment, or you cannot possibly hope to succeed. These constantly refreshing choices are what keeps the game interesting and engaging well after the combat has run its course with you. Beyond this, there's the usual RPG fare in the form of different classes and types of weapons. The number of options for weapons and auxiliary items cannot be understated, and the game's opening screen does a good job of hammering home the level of variety available. But this variety would be entirely overwhelming to a new player, and would take the learning curve from a gradual slope to a steep and very sloppy incline, as the player would take ages to adjust and acclimate to the hundreds of possible weapon and item combinations. Luckily, the game has a solution to this, and it's right there in the name: cells. Cells are the equivalent of the souls in Dark Souls, and this is one of the main pieces of inspiration that Dead Cells takes from Dark Souls. Cells are dropped at semi-random from enemies in a level. This is relatively consistent from level to level, as virtually every level will leave you with a relatively predictable number of cells each time you complete it, with each level you progress through giving you slightly more than the level prior. These cells are used to purchase upgrades, and these upgrades consist of a few different types. You can get permanent upgrades that persist with each and every one of your character's deaths, and they are experienced or accessible in every single playthrough, such as potion upgrades, the ability to hang on to more gold after death, and the ability to sell unneeded items for an increasing amount of gold over time. Also, you can get momentary upgrades that actually serve two functions. The upgrades are weapons or items, and purchasing them with cells grants you both a copy of that item to use in the moment, and that item is added to the game's overall loot table. meaning that while it was not possible to find this item before you purchased it, it will now be possible to find that item in the game. This might sound like it would make the game easier, but that's not always the case. This is the primary system that keeps the difficulty consistent even well into the game, where a skilled player has long since gotten the hang of the combat. While this does add ever more powerful weapons to the loot table, it also makes each run less and less predictable, meaning you will have to plan on the fly the progression of your character. There is no way to control what you're going to find. You may have been planning for a melee-based build, but you pass the third set of levels, and the only higher tier items you can find are ranged, so you're just going to have to roll with it and adjust as best as you can. There are tons and tons of other systems in the game that interweave with one another. There are damage synergies between weapons that will help you tackle later areas and bosses more consistently and easier. There are particular configurations that favor new players or that favor expert players, but there's one common through line that connects every single one of these systems, and it's that they all serve the... So, if you haven't already guessed by now, though you probably have, the primary loop of this game revolves around combat. And I mentioned earlier that one of the main inspirations this game takes from Dark Souls is in the Cells system. Well, this is the other main way. The combat in Dead Cells is extremely tight and based entirely around timing. It's almost like a rhythm game in how tight the combat loops are. The enemies in the early game have a very clear and obvious set of tells that let the player know they're about to attack, which introduces the player to the process of dodging, possibly blocking, and the different means of attack. As the player progresses, the player is faced by an ever-increasing amount of enemies with less and less obvious tells, making the player increasingly more observant of the animations of each and every type of enemy. I would be amazed after a few hours of play if most, if not all, players would have the timing of each and every one of the game's first couple enemy types completely timed out in their head. This makes the game feel fair, which is incredibly important. Even in Dark Souls and Bloodborne, there are moments where a death can feel cheap, as there are some situations in those games respectively where a player may not be able to see an attack coming or predict a particular enemy behavior because of an overly large weapon or something that happens partially off screen. Dead Cells manages to avoid this almost entirely, and with the exception of teleporting enemies, never manages to feel quite cheap. These teleporting enemies give more to the game than they take from it, however, as they force the player to deal with high-pressure combat situations, where running isn't really even an option. In addition to these teleporting enemies, there are also increasingly dangerous ranged enemies, and enemies with their own sort of trap moves, dedicated to pulling in and damaging the player. This keeps the difficulty curve of the game steady, though I have to admit there are certain areas of the game that are something of a wall to the player, where the difficulty spikes quite a bit higher than usual. This can be really frustrating, but ultimately makes the process of figuring it out and succeeding in a particular area all that much more gratifying, as they usually force the player to figure out how to leverage their weapons and tools to take on and take out enemies with particular situational weaknesses. But speaking of these specific tools, each weapon and item in the game is built with a particular purpose or situational use in mind. There are ranged weapons that deal less outright damage, but are automatically locked on to the nearest enemy, which is the easiest way to deal with flying enemies, smaller enemies, or enemies that just happen to move really quickly. There are ranged weapons that pierce targets and are able to help with groups of weaker enemies. There are weapons with an area of effect, weapons with a really sluggish attack but insanely high damage, and the purpose for these weapons can vary from dealing specifically and exclusively with bosses to handling virtually any and every other situation you'll come across. Now, I do wish there were a greater quantity of boss encounters in the game, because the game is pretty sparse on powerful individual enemies, and most of the game throws a larger number of smaller enemies at you rather than just one powerful enemy. There are several bosses in the game, which I would prefer not to spoil, since as few as there are, it would be a shame not to let you figure them out and experience them for yourself. But regardless, it would be nice to have maybe one of these larger boss encounters in each, or at the very least every other one of the game's levels. This would make for a more broad combat strategy on behalf of the player, because as the combat stands currently, the loadouts and skill sets that are best for dealing with the general enemies, the ones that you're going to find throughout the level, are very rarely the best tools for dealing with the game's bosses. This has a lot to do with those synergy systems that I briefly mentioned earlier, as status effects and damage bonuses based around status effects are absolutely the way to go for handling bosses, but range from ineffective to completely pointless when it comes to the game's normal enemies. Not because they don't damage normal enemies fast enough, but because the time it takes to use those items or techniques or combinations to apply those effects are almost always slower than just outright nuking the enemy and whacking it, since the time to kill for most enemies is pretty fast regardless, right up until you start hitting the really later sections of the game. This is ultimately a relatively minor complaint, considering the combat as it is still fast and dynamic. Speaking of fast, though, speedrunning has become a much more mainstream pursuit in games of late, and nowhere is this more apparent than in Dead Cells. So Dead Cells has a time gate feature that encourages the player to master the controls on a level where they can successfully hit all of these time gates by speedrunning each of the game's areas. As a new player, you will probably see these time gates as impossible. In my first 4 to 5 hours or so, I did not hit a single time gate, and I was pretty sure I wasn't gonna. But as I started to commit to the general shape of each level and the attack animations of the enemies, and reached a level of mastery over the controls, I started to realize not only were they possible, but that if I played perfectly, I could actually nab all of the 1-up items in a level and still hit the time gate. The first time I pulled this off, and I pulled it off on 4 levels in a row no less, and I was on cloud 9 at that point. It was one of the most gratifying experiences I've had in a video game, especially lately. And this is a small mechanic on the grand scale, but the effects of it can be significant, and it's a sign of the greater amount of passion and effort that was put into this game. The initial purpose of the mechanic is the player is meant to trade the usual goal of killing every enemy and finding every piece of loot to just finding the exit as fast as possible. And this puts the speedrunning player in a combat disadvantage, as they will not have the access to the same quality or quantity of loot, and definitely not the same number of 1-up items. However, once a player achieves a certain level of mastery over the game, it's possible to speedrun the game essentially without trade-offs, meaning that a perfectly executed speedrun will virtually always result in a character that is, at least at the base level, more powerful than one done the conventional way. Whether this was the intent of the design or not, I can't say for sure, but I think it was. What I can say is, this starts a brand new skill curve, and feels like discovering the game all over again, somewhere near the 13 to 14 hour mark or so. This one mechanic was what really gave the game its staying power for me, and took it over the top, past the point of average and into the great, but the game is more intuitive than you might think based on this particular category. So, speaking of intuitive, so every time I do a review or analysis, I have somebody that's less experienced with the genre or with games as a whole play whatever it is I'm reviewing, and I do mean every time. This helps me get a perspective that I can't get myself, because I've played too many games and I've played them for too long at this point. It's hard for me to get into the mindset of a brand new or casual player, and this is a pretty intimidating game as a newcomer, especially if you're not super into games on the whole, relatively speaking anyway. But after coaching my girlfriend through her first play session, she picked the game up pretty quickly. She plays at a different pace than I do, and she utilizes loadouts that minimize the amount of dodging that she has to do, but she gets the job done one way or another. At this point, she's made it to roughly the same point in the game as I have, and this is without any experience with games of this type, and very little experience with games on the whole. Just to assure this was not an isolated incident, I had my young nephew play the game as well and saw very similar results. He has very little experience with games of this type, though he is definitely a gamer on the whole. The point is, the game is flexible enough that it's able to be intuitively played and understood by a huge spectrum of gamers at or around wildly different skill levels. And why is this such a big deal? Because there are many games that sacrifice their depth in the pursuit of accessibility, or vice versa, but Dead Cells manages to hang on to both by building in smart systems that different types of players will naturally interact with differently. It's a little like skateboarding. In skateboarding, You have people that stand goofy-footed, and people that stand regular. This just refers to their dominant foot and which direction they're most comfortable facing while they're moving forward. Now, when I was a kid, the way to learn what way you were comfortable standing on a skateboard was to just put your skateboard in the grass and just jump onto it, and whatever way you chose to land on it was probably the right stance for you. Dead Cells gives the player the tools to just jump on and see how they like to ride, and this is a sadly uncommon trait in games. But regardless, at this point I think I've talked enough, so we can just wrap this up. So I think it's pretty clear at this point that I love this game. Unfortunately, the main news story about this game revolves around a plagiarism controversy. And ultimately, I decided to do this specific review because I was so annoyed by the fact that some stupid turd couldn't even be bothered to talk about one of the greatest games of this year. This game deserves to be put in the spotlight, it really does, and not just because some moron couldn't be bothered to finish his homework. This game deserves to be in the spotlight because it is awesome. It is brilliantly designed, it's intuitive, it's insanely fun, it's beautiful, and more than anything else, it was clearly made with passion. And the world needs more designers and more creators that truly put their passion into their work, and this is just that. I would recommend this game to really anyone that enjoys 2D games, anyone that enjoys games like Dark Souls, Bloodborne, or the character action games made by Platinum Games, and even if that doesn't sound like you, I'd still recommend that you give it a try if you can. I know I painted with a broad brush here, but it is my legitimate and honest opinion that this game has a fairly universal appeal, and is especially important for anyone that considers themselves a student of game design. So that's the review. 9 out of 10. Would buy again. Now just one more thing. As I said, I've been away from YouTube for a pretty long time, and I'm glad to be back in the saddle. What game do you think I should talk about next? I am between the following 3 options for the most part. 1. Talk about the game Mafia 2 and why I absolutely hate it. 2. Talk about God of War and why I absolutely love it. Or 3. Talk about the MMO genre, its mechanical origins, and why it has completely fallen out of relevance. Post a comment below letting me know which of those you want me to do. Please consider supporting me on Patreon if you enjoy what I do. I understand the hesitance in doing so, but I plan to have a far more consistent release schedule going forward. I refuse to put ads on my videos no matter what, so this is really the only way I have to recoup any of the losses or any of the money and time I put into these videos. It would mean a lot to me and it'd help me immensely. But regardless, thanks everyone, and you have a good one.